In this video, I'm going to show you how to replace the front and rear valve cover gaskets on this Dodge Grand Caravan. Let's get started. Remove your engine cover if your vehicle has one. Just pull straight up on it. Now we can continue with our job. Pull the little red locking tab backwards to unlock the connector, just like that. Now you can press down on that, pull the connector right out. And now with this unplugged, let's pop this retainer out of the intake, set that aside. Might as well follow this harness right over here. Got another retainer, pop that off on the throttle body. Just like this. Unplug the throttle body connector. There we go. One last connector over here. Unplug this. Now you can set the whole harness aside, out of the way of the intake. Take this hose off, just slide it off the air box. Now you can flip it up. Be careful because it is hard plastic. You don't want to break it. Follow it over on this side and just pop it off of here. I'm going to take this air intake duct out of the way. It's got two clamps. Both are 8mm headed screws. Loosen these up. There's another one on the air box side. With those off, you should be able to wiggle this right off. Sometimes they get stuck from being here for so long. The plastic gets stuck to the rubber. There we go. Pull this aside. To get this off, it's just sitting on some rubber grommets. So pull really hard upwards, it'll pop out. And then you should be able to just slide it out of place. Once it's off the back and off the throttle body, pull backwards. That'll unlodge it off the front. And you can take this out. Let's take this hose off of here, set that aside, pull this hose off of the intake. This is for the rear valve cover PCV valve, and then there's another one right here. This is also a vacuum hose. Be gentle if you have to use anything to pry these off. You don't want to break anything. Just slowly push them off. There we go. At the front of the engine here, where the manifold bolts onto these two brackets, it's supposed to have two 10mm sized nuts. Well, mine are missing. I will put them back when the time comes to reinstall everything, but right now I see brackets that are slightly bent and two missing mounting nuts. So if yours are still there, which they should be, remove them. I'm going to address the situation once the manifold is off of here. On the back side of the manifold, where the throttle body is, you'll notice a similar bracket setup here with two 10mm nuts. These are here. We're going to have to pull this bracket off. To do that, I'm going to take the retainer for this wire off. There's also another one right down here which exposes its main anchor point. I'm going to take the two 10mm off. And now let's take off that 13mm down there. With that out, you should be able to pull the bracket off. Looks like there's one more wire attached to it. Pull that out. Now you can remove the bracket. Now there are 7 8mm headed bolts that hold this intake, the upper intake, onto the lower. I'm going to work my way from the outer bolts to the inner bolts, just breaking them free. And then once they're broken free, I will remove them the rest of the way. These bolts will not come out completely. They will stay in the intake. Now grab the intake, pull it straight up, set it aside. Now I'm going to cover these ports with a cloth. That way nothing can fall in there. You can use anything else such as tape or shove some rags down there, but just cover it so debris can't make its way down. Now let's remove all the ignition coils, unplug them, press down on the little tab and pull the wire off. 10mm bolts hold these on. Remove all the bolts and then pull the ignition coils straight out. If they stay in, leave them in. If they come out, take them out. Pull these off, set these aside, remove the harness from these retainers. And now we have to unplug the injectors so that we can get the entire harness moved away from the valve cover. Sometimes it's easiest if you just use some needle nose pliers, unless you can get your hand down there, but it's not always easiest. There we go. If you do use pliers, pinch them very gently, otherwise you'll crush the connector or potentially break the wires. There we go. Set this aside. Unplug the cam position sensor, push the locking tab backwards, press down on this, pull the harness off, and this is a T30 Torx bolt. So get a T30 socket, remove that. Now pull the sensor straight up, set it aside safely. To remove the variable valve timing solenoids, the procedure will be exactly the same for any of the four you want to remove. On the passenger side of your engine, you'll have an electrical connector. Unplug that, set it aside, and then 3 T25 Torx bolts will hold this onto the valve cover. Remove all 3. Make sure you don't drop these. They have to be reused, and they are very small. At this point, if you had a lot of debris around here, you'd go ahead and clean it up. Mine isn't too bad, so I'm not worried about it, but you don't want anything getting inside the engine when you pull this off. Wiggle it slowly. Now let's take the other one off. Oh, the O-ring on this one stayed on the valve cover. Pull this off. I marked the exhaust VVT solenoid with a yellow crayon just because I want to make sure I put them back where they come out of. My intake VVT solenoid is not marked with anything. I'm going to pull this O-ring off also. We have to free up the harness retainer here. It kind of loops over the valve cover. So I'm going to take a trim tool, pop this retainer off of here. There we go. And now if you follow this bracket, it actually goes down here. You may not be able to fit a trim tool, but if you pull straight up on it, it should free this up. And now the harness can move out of your way slightly this direction so we can free up the valve cover on this side. Towards the driver's side of the valve cover, if you follow that harness that we just removed from the retainer, you'll have a similar looking retainer that holds this harness down, pulls straight up. That'll unclip it from 2 mounting points. Now we have access to all the mounting hardware holding this valve cover on, so let's pull that off and remove the valve cover. Remove all the valve cover bolts, starting from the outer ones, working your way towards the middle. They're all 8mm in size. They will not come out of the valve cover, they will stay, but you can at least unthread them all the way. To remove this last stud here, unfortunately we're going to have to loosen up the mounting point for this bracket. It has a 13mm stud on it. You're going to have to sneak a deep socket down there and break this free. You don't have to remove the stud, you just have to loosen it up enough to pivot this bracket. Now that you've loosened it up a few turns, you should be able to move it out of your way enough to get that 8mm stud out. And with that loose, all we have to do is pry the valve cover up a little bit. It might be stuck on the gasket. Now try not to pry too hard. You don't want to break it. You also don't want to damage anything else around it. Be very, very gentle and just slowly work this valve cover up. You want to make sure you don't pry on anything plastic or wires or anything like that. Oh, there we go. Other than the gasket itself being stuck all the way around, you also have spark plug tube seals that are stuck on the tubes themselves. So that's what we're fighting right now. Just have to break all that free. If you pry on the oil filler tube here, filler neck, be very gentle because it can snap off the valve cover. Just work it back and forth slowly. There we go. All right, now it's free. Just have to move this wire harness out of the way. And there is your valve cover. The gasket is partially coming off of it. If it's stuck on the head, pull that off. Now let's replace the gasket. Once you pull the valve cover off, if you notice any sort of debris like this, where it's just dust basically and dirt buildup, you want to get rid of that immediately. You don't want that to end up in the engine. I have a vacuum that I'm going to vacuum this up with. If you don't have that, you can easily just wipe it off, but be very careful to wipe obviously outward, not inward towards the engine. Next, you'll want to pull off old remaining RTV that is on the head here. This is right where the head meets the timing cover, and yes, we will have to apply more, but for now we need to get rid of this old RTV so that we can clean the surface. This one's stuck here, so I'm just going to use a razor blade and scrape it off. Anything that we scrape from here on out, scrape outward, not inward towards the engine. Just do your best. If you are afraid of getting anything in, you can cover it with some rags. Now I'm going to go around the whole surface and very lightly clean all this debris up. I don't want anything in the way of the gasket sealing up properly. I recommend using a razor blade because it is gentle. Anything like sandpaper or a sanding disc can definitely damage the surface. And in all honesty, this is pretty clean, so you could just wipe it off with a rag, but a razor blade will easily scrape it all off. Now, it doesn't have to look perfect. You just have to get rid of the dirt and corrosion debris that's built up here. Now with our valve cover on the bench here, I'm going to start at the top. I'm going to punch out these 3 spark plug tube seal grommets. I'm going to use a little pry bar and very gently hammer these down. That's 1, 2, and 3. On the end right here, we have a little grommet seal for the camshaft position sensor. Pop that off as well. On the ends with the VVT solenoids, the 2 O-rings I already pulled off. If not, pull them off now. And I'm actually going to take the oil filler tube off so that I can flip the valve cover down and have it lay flat. To do this, it has a little hook here. Pry up on it and turn counterclockwise. When you do that, it'll unlock. You can pull this out and set it aside. And now we can flip this over flat and remove the valve cover gasket itself. If you can't get it, grab a pick, pry it up, and remove it from the valve cover. At this point, if you wanted to clean your valve cover inside and out, you'd go ahead and do so. I'm going to find a driver that'll drive my new spark plug tube seals in. I'm going to start with those. Now get your new seals. They go in with the beveled edge facing towards the inside of the valve cover, so in this case up. If you put them backwards, well, not only may they not fit, but you're going to have a really hard time putting that valve cover down because the spark plug tube is not going to be able to slide in smoothly. Having said that, I also am going to use a 27mm socket to drive these down because it fits perfectly on the outer edge of these seals. I don't want to drive them down with a punch or anything that might damage them. Also, if you put just a little bit of lubrication on the sides of them, whether it's engine oil, a little bit of transmission fluid, or just a very, very light amount of oil-based grease, that should help you slide them in a little bit easier. So set it down in place and very gently tap them down with a hammer and your driver, in my case, a socket. Okay, it's started. Let's finish driving it down. Basically, just go until it bottoms out. That's how you know it's done. A little bit more. That looks good right there. If you go too far or if you hammer too hard, you could crack the valve cover, so you want to be careful. Perfectly bottomed out. It will have a tiny bit of a lip on this side, so that's normal. Now let's just do the rest. Now I'm going to flip this over and I'm going to clean out this hole right here for the camshaft position sensor. I'm going to install that new grommet there. Take the new seal, press it down. It should be a snug fit, even if the old one came off easily. That's probably because it's worn out. Okay, that's installed. You want to make sure it's flush all the way around. You can very, very gently, with a small screwdriver, if you have to, pull it down from the inner lip, but be very careful if you have to do that, because you can pierce right through it and then, well, you need a new one. Now let's install the VVT solenoid O-rings. I'm just going to clean very gently in here in case there's any debris or grease, oil, whatever was left in there. I don't want to install the seals with any brake parts cleaner in there, so I'm just going to blow the holes out gently. Now take the new O-rings, line them up. They're all the same. You're going to have 4 in your kit. The cutouts here will have little tabs that actually lock onto the O-rings, so once you press them on, you don't need to worry about them falling off. And yes, they will stick out a little bit. They are not supposed to sit flush. That's normal. Put the other one on. Make sure you don't pinch it or bend it in any way. If it doesn't slide in smoothly, then check the cutout. Sometimes there's debris stuck in there. There we go. Now we can flip this over and install the main valve cover gasket. Now let's clean this area with some brake parts cleaner. There's quite a bit of oil buildup in there, as well as some debris along the sides. So I'm just going to spray this off with brake parts cleaner. I like to start at the top and just follow the path here. Let it run down and do its thing. Okay, now we'll dry this off with some compressed air. Now grab your valve cover gasket. Of course, you'll have 2 of them, but only one will fit each valve cover. They are directional. You want to make sure that these thicker areas lock onto these cutouts on the end of the valve cover where the VVT solenoids sit, and they are directional. So you'll see this little tab here. This is here so that you can easily remove the valve cover gasket. However, when you look at it, you'll notice one side is longer, the other side is shorter. The longer side actually sits into the groove of the valve cover, and the rest of it sticks up, and that's what seals up against the head. So that's how you know. Also, one side has cutouts that go around the bolts, the other side does not. As long as you match it all up, it should fit perfectly. It should be molded to fit the entire valve cover all the way around. If it doesn't fit, you probably have the wrong side. This should lock into place. It should not want to fall off. Should be a somewhat snug fit. All right, once that's done, let's flip this over. I'm going to reinstall my oil filler neck. Now, if you had oil leaks coming from here, this is a great time to replace that O-ring. Mine is just fine, so I'm going to reuse it. Find the cutout that makes it drop in like that, and then turn it clockwise until this locks in. Once you hear the click, it should be locked in, so this valve cover is ready to be put back on the engine. Now back on the engine, right before we're about to install the valve cover back on, I want to degrease. I have some brake parts cleaner on the end of my rag here. I'm going to degrease this area where the timing cover meets the head, and if you look on the other side of this timing chain, there will be a similar looking area. The reason I'm degreasing these is because we have to reapply a little bit of RTV to help seal up between these 2 surfaces. Otherwise, you will most likely have a leak because the rubber gasket cannot perfectly seal this crack between the 2. You don't need to put a lot. Just a small dab and then spread it around here. Basically, it's just enough to cover this crack. If you put too much, it'll actually get inside the engine. And now I'm just going to do the same on the other side. Right down here, you'll see a very similar looking crack. Now take your valve cover and very carefully put it right back on here. The things you want to pay attention to is that you don't pinch the gasket on here, especially as you slide it down like that. You also want to make sure you don't pinch any wires while you put this down. And you want to make sure the spark plug tubes actually slide on. Sometimes you have to wiggle those around until they line up. The harness on this driver's side here is going to be what you're going to fight the most. There we go. That drops down nicely. And slide these on. Check for any wires. I'm good. Press it. Once you press it down, these should somewhat lock into place. And then we'll be able to start our bolts by hand. If these don't start easily, that means they're not lined up, so you're going to have to move that valve cover around. Go around, make sure that they all do the same. Now let's snug these up before we torque them down. The torque is 106 inch-pounds, not foot-pounds, inch-pounds. That converts to 8.8 foot-pounds, so it's a very low torque. So when you snug them up, you want to be careful not to over-tighten these. The sequence for tightening these bolts is important so that you don't crack the valve cover. The sequence will be on the screen for you so you can follow that. Basically, I'm going to start in the outer corners and work my way towards the middle. All right, let's torque them. Once again, 106 inch-pounds or 8.8 foot-pounds. If you don't have a torque wrench that goes that low, just make them nice and snug with a very small ratchet. They are small bolts and you don't want to break any of them. Now, although I'm done torquing it, technically, I will go over it again because oftentimes when you squish a rubber gasket, as you're done torquing the first few bolts will actually loosen up a little bit from the gasket squishing, creating more slack. This time, you don't necessarily have to go in a cross pattern because they should be pretty much at their torque, if not there already. So I'm just going to go around and check all of them. There we go, it's all torqued. Let's put everything back together here. Drop the cam position sensor in. As you do that, make sure the bolt lines up. Start it by hand so it doesn't cross thread. Snug it up. Once it's bottomed out, switch to a hand ratchet if you're not already using it. That's bottomed out right there. I'm gonna give it just a tiny little bit of a turn. Basically, you want to let the O-ring around the bolt do the sealing. There's also a gasket here. You don't want to crush anything down. And just make it tight enough to hold on. Connect the connector. Once that clicks, lock it down. When reinstalling your ignition coils, I recommend putting a little bit of silicone paste in here, just on the edges of this boot. Not too much, because if you put too much, it'll actually prevent a good connection between the coil and the spark plug. But putting this on a little bit will prevent it from getting stuck on the spark plug in the future. So slide these down. I'm going to start all of them in before I snug up the bolts. That way I can just do all the bolts at once. 10mm socket, snug these up. Let's get this harness reconnected. I'm going to start with the injectors. Make sure they all click. That way they are properly secured. And now lock these in here. And connect the ignition coils. Make sure these also click. You don't want any of these coming unplugged while you're driving. Now let's put this harness back down. The plastic push clips stayed in the bracket, so I'm just going to line them up and push them down, just like that. Make sure it's secured. Now let's put the VVT solenoids back in. When you put these back, clean this area off to make sure there's no debris. And then of course you're going to want to put the VVT solenoids back from the same port that they came off of. Once again, I marked this one with a yellow crayon. This was my exhaust VVT. I'm going to hold it on here and start the mounting bolts in. If they don't want to start in, well, it's probably because you don't have it lined up. So just spin it around a little bit until it lines up. Once you put this one in, you can let go and start in the other ones. Now with your T25 socket, tighten these up. They are very small bolts. You don't want to break the little tabs or the inserts in the valve cover, so just bottom them out, make them nice and snug. As soon as they bottom out like this, just a tiny bit extra is all you need to properly tighten these. I'm going to check them. That's it. Plug it in. Make sure the connector clicks. I didn't hear it, but I did feel it, so it's locked in. Let's put in the other one. Plug this in, make sure it clicks. Now before we set the upper intake back on, you want to make sure you check these gaskets, and if they are still pliable, soft, and they're not flat, so these are raised up a little bit, they're good to go, you can reuse them. If they are stiff or flat completely with the lower intake, you're going to want to replace them so that it can seal up properly. Next, put this foam piece on. Mine is in okay condition, it's not great. If yours is completely falling apart, you're better off removing it rather than it falling apart underneath the intake here. But if it's reusable, go ahead and reuse it. Now as you put the upper intake in, make sure it lines up with these two brackets here. So I'm going to bring it in, line those two up, and press it backwards like that. And then, as long as the brackets are still lined up like they were before, when you put this down, all the bolts here should line up into their bolt holes. So before I bolt on any brackets, it is important to actually bolt it to the lower intake first so that this is sealed up, then you secure everything around it. Now let's tighten these up. I'm just going to snug them at first, get the bolts nice and close, but I will follow the appropriate sequence for this. You'll see it on the screen. .89 inch-pounds is the torque for this. That converts to 7.4 foot-pounds. We'll follow the same exact sequence. Okay, let's go around one more time. All right, that's torqued. Now let's get this rear bracket in. Not only do you have to line it up with the studs, but before I put it down all the way in, it'll be easier for me to resecure this harness onto it right now. Just like that. Now I'll line it up with these, and automatically it should pretty much line up with the mounting bolt or mounting hole for this stud at the bottom. There was only one. Okay, I'm going to thread that by hand until I get it close, and then we'll snug that up. The torque for this is 177 inch-pounds. That converts to 14.8 foot-pounds. Let's make sure it's nice and tight here so it can hold that intake manifold on the bracket properly. Make sure everything is still lined up before you torque this. That's it right there. Now let's put these mounting nuts on. Now with your 10mm, snug them up. These don't need to be very tight, they just need to be snug. You don't want to break the studs or strip the threads. Now let's do the two front ones. And now let's get the two front mounting nuts on. These were the ones that I was missing before removing this, but you want to make sure you re-secure them so that the intake is properly secured to the engine. Same with these, just make them nice and snug after they bottom out about 1/8 of a turn. Re-secure the upper radiator hose to the intake. Re-secure your wiring harness onto that stud. There was another retainer over there. This also gets clipped into the PCV hose. And then might as well plug in the PCV hose while we're at it. Try not to bend this part too much because it is hard plastic, so you can break it, but make sure that this is seated all the way, or at least most of the way. You can see where the fitting ends. Re-secure this over here, and might as well plug this in while we're at it. Make sure that clicks. This did have a lock, so make sure you lock that down. Put this hose back on the intake, re-secure this over here, and then another attachment point there, but make sure the PCV hose goes over, or the vacuum hose. Secure that, and plug the throttle body back in. Make sure that clicks. Let's put this piece back on. When you put it on, make sure it fully seats on that throttle body so you don't have any air leaks. It also has two little dowels on the back that it has to line up with, as well as on the intake here. Press that down. Once you press it down, you should not be able to easily pull it back off. That's how you know it's seated. Plug this in. Take your air intake duct, place it on the intake side. Make sure it's bottomed out completely. Has a little notch on the top that has to line up over here. And same on the air filter housing. Once it's perfectly seated, go ahead and snug up these bolts. Once it's fully seated, snug up these clamps. For these, you don't have to tighten them a lot. Once they bottom out and get snug, stop right there, because if you over tighten them, it'll actually strip the little screw in there, and then you'll have to replace the clamp. Okay, that's it right there. Let's tighten up this one over here. Now get this PCV hose re-secured on the valve cover, the front valve cover here, and then this one runs over all the way to the air box. Press both of these ends on all the way. Now take your engine cover, line it back up, snap it down. Now with everything back together, turn the engine on, take it for a road test.
When only the best will do, demand TRQ. The only company that lets you view before you do. TRQ is committed to offering the highest quality aftermarket auto parts that are engineered for peace of mind. Thanks for using and viewing with TRQ.